April 24th, 2018. The final metal shutters rolled down across Britain. The iconic, multicolored Geoffrey the Giraffe signs were quietly dismantled, and the once bustling aisles of Toys R Us were plunged into a cold, permanent darkness. On that single day, a retail giant did not just close its doors. A cornerstone of British childhood was abruptly erased, leaving over 3,000 people standing in the dole queue. For an entire generation, this was the undisputed king of retail. At its zenith, Toys R Us operated over 100 massive, warehouse-style superstores across the United Kingdom. It was a destination, a weekend ritual where families roamed aisles stacked from floor to ceiling with every conceivable toy. To children of the 90s, it truly was a magical place. Yet fast forward to that grim spring morning in 2018, and the empire had been reduced to nothing but echoing empty retail parks and devastating liquidation sales. The magic was gone, replaced by a bleak silence. How does an undisputed monopoly, a brand practically synonymous with Christmas itself, evaporate so completely? How does a company with such absolute market dominance allow itself to be outmaneuvered and outpriced into total oblivion? The convenient excuse is to point the finger at Amazon and the internet. But the reality is far darker and far more complex. This is a story of catastrophic boardroom decisions, the ruthless, crushing weight of Wall Street leveraged buyouts, and a fatal arrogance that left an industry titan paralyzed in the digital age. This is not just a tale of changing consumer habits. This is the autopsy of an empire that mortgaged its own future and ultimately paid the ultimate price. Before the autumn of 1985, the British toy market was a world of quiet charm and limited choice. For generations, purchasing a toy in the United Kingdom meant a Saturday morning stroll down the local high street. You might visit a small independent shop with a ringing bell above the door, where the proprietor kept the most coveted items safely tucked behind a glass counter. Alternatively, a family might venture into the toy section of a beloved high street staple like Woolworths, navigating narrow aisles to find a modest selection of board games, puzzles, and action figures. The experience was functional, traditional, and inherently constrained by the physical space of town centre real estate. Children rarely had the opportunity to physically interact with a vast array of products. Toys were presented as singular, special occasion purchases, not a sweeping landscape to be explored. But across the Atlantic, a retail revolution had already redefined how children consumed play. The American big box model, pioneered by Toys R Us founder Charles Lazarus, had created a phenomenon known as the category killer. The concept was brutally effective. Build a store so massive and fill it with so much inventory in a single category that no traditional retailer could possibly compete on price or selection. It was, quite simply, a supermarket for toys, operating on economies of scale that the British market had never witnessed. And in the mid-1980s, this American juggernaut set its sights on the United Kingdom. The location chosen for this retail invasion was deliberate. Instead of squeezing into a crowded, expensive city centre, Toys R Us targeted the emerging out-of-town retail spaces. In September 1985, the very first British Toys R Us opened its doors in Woking, Surrey. To the average British consumer, the sight of the building alone was a cultural shock. It was not a shop, it was an industrial-scale warehouse, boasting a vast, stark exterior, surrounded by a sea of tarmac parking spaces. It required a dedicated car journey to reach, instantly transforming the act of buying a toy from a quick pedestrian errand into a major family excursion. Stepping through the sliding glass doors of the Woking store was akin to crossing into another dimension. The quiet restraint of the British high street vanished, replaced by an overwhelming, fluorescent-lit cathedral of consumerism. Children, accustomed to peering over counters, were suddenly confronted with miles of wide, linoleum aisles. Shelves stretched dizzyingly upwards, stacked from the floor to the very ceiling with brightly coloured boxes. There were no glass display cabinets holding back the merchandise. Instead, the stock was piled high, inviting a tactile, immersive experience that felt dangerously close to tearing open presents on Christmas morning. Perhaps the most alien concept introduced that day was the shopping trolley. Until 1985, The idea of pushing a massive, metal supermarket trolley exclusively for toys was completely unheard of in Britain. Yet, as parents navigated the cavernous space, these trolleys became essential. The sheer volume of inventory was staggering. Entire, sprawling aisles were dedicated to single brands. One row might contain nothing but thousands of Star Wars figures, while the next presented an imposing wall of Transformers, My Little Ponies, or Cabbage Patch Kids. For a child of the 1980s, the sensory overload was intoxicating. It was an environment meticulously engineered to elicit wonder, desire, and the persistent tugging of a parent's sleeve. This was not merely a new store opening. It was a disruption of the British consumer psyche. Toys R Us stripped away the boutique charm of the traditional toy shop and replaced it with sheer unadulterated volume. They offered prices that local independents simply could not match, subsidized by their massive global buying power. The warehouse model meant that backroom storage was virtually eliminated. The store itself was the stockroom, creating an aesthetic of endless abundance. If a child wanted a specific bicycle, they didn't have to order it from a catalogue and wait weeks. They could simply point to one of the dozens chained to the display racks, put it in a flatbed trolley, and take it home in the boot of the car that very afternoon. For the local toy shop proprietors in the surrounding towns, the opening of the Woking warehouse was an ominous harbinger. How could a family-run business on a quaint high street, paying exorbitant city centre business rates for a few hundred square feet of space, compete with a multinational corporation operating a 50,000 square foot hangar? The answer, as the coming decade would ruthlessly demonstrate, was that they couldn't. The arrival of Toys R Us marked the beginning of a retail extinction event for the traditional British toy vendor. The success of the Woking opening was instantaneous and explosive. British families proved more than willing to abandon the high street in favour of the convenience, price, and sheer spectacle of the out-of-town megastore. The company had successfully exported an American dream, packaging it brilliantly for a British audience hungry for novelty and choice. The blueprint had been tested and proven spectacularly effective. The foundation of an empire had been poured into the Surrey concrete, setting the stage for a period of aggressive, unstoppable expansion. The magic had arrived on British shores, and it was about to rewrite the rules of the entire industry. The 1990s belonged to Geoffrey. If the Woking opening in 1985 was the beachhead, the following decade was an era of total, unchallenged conquest. Toys R Us did not simply participate in the British toy market, it devoured it, reshaping the cultural landscape of childhood in the process. For any child growing up in the United Kingdom during this era, the brand was not just a retailer. It was an emotion, an aspiration, and the ultimate weekend destination. At the heart of this cultural dominance was a masterclass in marketing, spearheaded by a single, inescapable melody. When the animated television adverts began to air, featuring a cartoon family driving towards a brightly lit warehouse, children across Britain would stop whatever they were doing to watch. There's a magical place. We're on our way there. The jingle was infectious, optimistic, and relentlessly broadcast. It embedded itself so deeply into the collective consciousness of a generation that, decades later, millions of British adults could still recite the lyrics verbatim. It was an anthem that promised infinite possibilities, all housed beneath a giant, multicolored roof. The face of this empire was, of course, Geoffrey the giraffe. He was far more than a corporate mascot. He was a towering, friendly ambassador of consumerism. Meeting a costume Geoffrey at a store opening or a weekend event was a genuine thrill for a child. The Geoffrey's Birthday Club sent personalized cards to young members, forging a brilliant, parasocial loyalty that ensured parents had little choice but to make the pilgrimage to the retail park when a birthday rolled around. Toys R Us had successfully branded the very concept of celebration. But perhaps the most powerful tool in their arsenal was the annual Christmas catalogue. Long before the era of targeted digital advertising, this weighty, glossy magazine, often affectionately referred to as the Big Book, would drop through letterboxes across the country in mid-autumn. Its arrival marked the official commencement of the festive season for British children. The catalogue was treated with the reverence of a sacred text. Siblings would spend hours poring over its densely packed pages, armed with thick marker pens, carefully circling the action figures, video game consoles, and board games they desperately desired. This analog ritual practically guaranteed immense, predictable footfall. Come November, parents, armed with their children's heavily annotated catalogues, would descend upon the stores in their thousands. To accommodate this staggering demand, the company engaged in an aggressive and relentless expansion strategy. The 1990s coincided with a significant shift in British urban planning, which saw the rapid proliferation of out-of-town retail parks. Toys R Us became the ultimate anchor tenant. Developers knew that securing a Toys R Us meant a guaranteed flow of affluent family traffic. From Glasgow to Cardiff, from Southampton to Newcastle, the giant warehouses, with their massive square footage and sprawling free car parks, became a ubiquitous feature of the British suburban landscape. By the late 1990s, the company had reached its absolute zenith. The UK operation boasted a formidable portfolio of over 100 superstores. They were moving millions of units of inventory, generating monumental revenues, and dictating terms to toy manufacturers. If a toy company wanted their product to succeed in Britain, it had to be on the shelves of Toys R Us. They had effectively crushed the independent high street toy shops, reducing them to a quaint, almost obsolete memory. The category killer had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had killed the competition. Inside the boardrooms, the mood was one of supreme, untouchable confidence. The executives looked at their empire, a fortress of over 100 massive concrete warehouses dominating the retail parks of Britain, and saw immortality. They possessed unmatched buying power, universal brand recognition, and a business model that seemed perfectly calibrated for endless profitability. The formula was stunningly simple: buy cheap, stack high, and let the sheer volume of stock draw the crowds. It had worked flawlessly for 15 years, and there was absolutely no reason to suspect it would ever stop working. Yet, the very architecture of their staggering success was hiding a fatal flaw. The company was inherently built on a foundation of massive, inflexible physical infrastructure. Those 100-plus cavernous warehouses required immense continuous capital for upkeep, lighting, heating, and staffing. The entire model demanded that families possess cars, have the free time to drive out of town, and be willing to navigate vast, echoing aisles to find what they needed. At the absolute peak of their golden age, blinded by record profits and the deafening chorus of their own magical jingle, the leadership failed to notice the subtle shifting of the wind. They believed their sheer size made them invulnerable. But in the retail landscape that was about to emerge at the dawn of the new millennium, size would no longer be an advantage. It was about to become an anchor. As the calendar turned to the year 2000, Toys R Us UK remained the undisputed heavyweight champion of the British toy industry. To the casual observer, the empire appeared entirely impregnable. The car parks outside their vast retail sheds were still packed on December weekends, and the catchy television jingles continued to broadcast the promise of a magical place. However, beneath the surface of this colossal retail machine, subtle but irreversible fractures were beginning to form. The danger of absolute dominance is the complacency it inevitably breeds, and as the new millennium dawned, the company fell victim to its own staggering success. The first and most visible symptom of this stagnation was the physical state of the stores themselves. The big box warehouse model that had been so utterly revolutionary when it arrived in Woking in 1985 was now 15 years old. What was once perceived as futuristic and awe-inspiring was rapidly becoming dated and utilitarian. For over a decade, there had been virtually no meaningful evolution in the customer experience. The company had coasted on the novelty of its sheer size, operating under the assumption that the volume of toys alone was enough to guarantee loyalty. Consequently, the physical environment began to reflect a glaring lack of reinvestment. The vast stretches of linoleum flooring, scuffed by millions of shopping trolleys and the restless feet of a generation, had lost their shine. The harsh, industrial fluorescent lighting cast a clinical glare over aisles that were frequently cluttered and poorly navigated. The towering shelves, once symbols of infinite childhood abundance, increasingly resembled the impersonal storage racks of a logistics depot. The magic that the marketing department so aggressively promised on television was starkly absent in the cold, echoing reality of the retail parks. A trip to Toys R Us was slowly transitioning from a magical family excursion into a sprawling, exhausting chore. While the giant slumbered in its aging warehouses, the landscape of British retail was silently shifting beneath its feet. The threat did not come from another dedicated toy chain. Toys R Us had already eradicated them. Instead, the danger emerged from an entirely different sector: the British supermarket giants. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, chains like Tesco, Asda, and Sainsbury's began aggressively expanding their non-food offerings. They were building their own massive, out-of-town hypermarkets, and they quickly recognized the lucrative potential of the toy market, particularly during the crucial final quarter of the year. The supermarkets possessed a structural advantage that Toys R Us fundamentally lacked: the frequency of customer visits. A family might drive to a Toys R Us retail park 3 or 4 times a year for birthdays and Christmas, but that same family visited their local Tesco or Asda every single week for their essential groceries. The supermarkets capitalized on this convenience brilliantly. They didn't need to stock 50,000 different items or dedicate aisles to obscure niche brands. They simply cherry-picked the top 50 best-selling toys of the season, the newest Barbie, the latest Harry Potter Lego set, the most sought-after video game console, and placed them right by the entrance or at the end of the grocery aisles. More devastatingly, the supermarkets employed the ruthless tactic of the loss leader. Asda, fortified by the immense financial muscle of its new parent company, Walmart, alongside a fiercely competitive Tesco, began slashing the prices of these blockbuster toys to cost, or even below cost. Their objective was not to make a profit on a board game. Their goal was to lure parents through the automatic doors. If a mother came in for a heavily discounted Action Man, she would inevitably fill her trolley with bread, milk, wine, and a week's worth of highly profitable groceries. Oh, Toys R Us was entirely defenseless against this strategy. As a category-specific retailer, they relied entirely on the profit margins of toys to keep the lights on in their massive warehouses. They simply could not afford to match the artificially deflated prices of the supermarkets. For the first time in its British history, Toys R Us was no longer the cheapest place to buy the most popular toys. The psychological shift in the British consumer was subtle but profound. The illusion that Toys R Us was an absolute necessity had been broken. Parents realized they could fulfill their children's Christmas lists while simultaneously doing the weekly food shop, saving both money and hours of navigating a separate, chaotic retail park. Faced with this mounting pressure, the logical response for Toys R Us would have been to pivot, to invest heavily in making their stores a premium, interactive destination that a supermarket could never replicate. They needed play zones, product demonstrations, and a radically modernized aesthetic to justify the journey. Instead, the boardroom chose paralysis. The profits generated by the UK stores were not ring-fenced for innovation or refurbishment. The company was slowly bleeding its own momentum, relying on a faded brand legacy to sustain a crumbling physical infrastructure. It was a perilous state of vulnerability. And tragically, just as this internal rot began to severely compromise the company's structural integrity, a catastrophic financial earthquake was preparing to strike from across the Atlantic, one that would shatter the empire's foundations forever. By the middle of the 2000s, the leadership at Toys R Us was acutely aware of the mounting pressure on their business model. The aggressive pricing tactics of the British supermarkets had exposed the vulnerability of their aging, cavernous stores. To survive and adapt, the company desperately needed a massive injection of capital. They needed funds to modernize their infrastructure, reinvent the customer experience, and repair the subtle fractures that were beginning to compromise their dominance. But instead of finding a lifeline to build a sustainable future, the company encountered a complex financial maneuver that would ultimately seal its fate. The fatal blow did not come from a rival high-street toy shop or a grocery giant in a retail park. It was orchestrated within the towering glass boardrooms of Wall Street. In July 2005, a consortium of three powerful investment firms, Bain Capital, Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, KKR, and Vornado Realty Trust, acquired the entire global operation of Toys R Us for an astonishing $6.6 billion. To the thousands of employees working the aisles in places like Woking, Cardiff, and Brent Cross, the news of a private equity buyout might have initially sounded like salvation. To the untrained ear, private equity implied deep pockets, fresh investment, and a bold, aggressive new strategy to reclaim market share. But the harsh reality of a leveraged buyout, or LBO, is vastly and fundamentally different from traditional business investment. In a classic leveraged buyout, the acquiring firms do not use their own liquid capital to purchase the company. Instead, they borrow the vast majority of the purchase price from major banks and institutional lenders. Critically, they secure that massive loan not against their own assets, but against the assets of the company they are acquiring. Almost overnight, the private equity consortium loaded approximately $5 billion of complex corporate debt directly onto the balance sheet of Toys R Us. The global toy retailer was, essentially, forced to take out a colossal, crippling mortgage on itself in order to fund its own acquisition. The mechanics of this 2005 deal fundamentally rewired the entire purpose of the corporation. Prior to the buyout, the primary objective of Toys R Us was to sell toys, generate a profit, and reinvest that profit into operational growth. After the ink dried on the LBO, the singular, all-consuming objective of the company was to service its staggering, newly acquired debt. The business was suddenly saddled with annual interest payments estimated at roughly $400 million. Before a single Barbie doll, Lego set, or bicycle was sold, and before a single store's electricity bill was paid, the company had to find hundreds of millions of dollars just to keep its creditors at bay and avoid immediate default. The executives in America were playing a high-stakes game of financial engineering. They viewed the steady, predictable cash flow generated by the international division, particularly the robust Christmas trading period in the United Kingdom, not as a fund for revitalizing the fading British retail parks, but as a highly reliable source of capital to siphon off for debt servicing. The physical stores and the brand legacy were treated merely as collateral on a spreadsheet. The disconnect between the corporate financiers in New York and the operational reality on the scuffed linoleum floors of Birmingham and Glasgow was absolute. This was the beginning of a slow corporate asphyxiation. The devastating reality of the leveraged buyout quickly trickled down to the British shop floor. For the UK division, which had historically been one of the crown jewels of the international portfolio, the debt burden acted like an invisible, insatiable parasite, draining the lifeblood out of the business. The British stores were still generating substantial revenue, with millions of parents still making the annual pilgrimage during the crucial golden quarter leading up to Christmas. Yet the profits the British teams fought so fiercely to secure against the encroaching supermarkets were instantly swallowed by the transatlantic debt vacuum. The physical and psychological consequences of this financial starvation were stark. Store managers across the United Kingdom who submitted urgent requests for capital expenditure to fix leaking roofs, repair failing air conditioning units, or replace the fading, decades-old exterior signage were routinely and systematically denied. The aesthetic decay that had subtly begun in the early 2000s now rapidly accelerated into visible neglect. The destination that had once promised a magical place was increasingly characterized by water-stained ceiling tiles, flickering and buzzing fluorescent lights, and threadbare carpets. The stores felt cold, uncared for, and profoundly depressing. The human cost was equally severe. To maximize the cash flow required for the interest payments, operational budgets were slashed to the bone. This inevitably meant severe cuts to staffing levels on the shop floor. The expansive 50,000-square-foot warehouses were increasingly manned by skeleton crews. Employees were stretched to breaking point, unable to maintain the sprawling aisles, restock the towering shelves efficiently, or provide the basic level of customer service that parents expected. The shopping experience transitioned from an exciting family adventure into a frustrating, exhausting ordeal of navigating cluttered aisles and searching in vain for assistance. Furthermore, the colossal debt fundamentally destroyed the company's agility. Retail is a fiercely dynamic and unforgiving industry. Survival requires the ability to pivot swiftly, experiment with new concepts, and take calculated operational risks. But with the crushing weight of a multi-billion-dollar loan anchoring them down, the executive team became entirely paralyzed and deeply risk-averse. Every single penny was micromanaged for debt service. There was simply no budget available to overhaul the archaic business model, no capital to shrink the massive, expensive stores into more manageable, experiential retail spaces, and absolutely no financial breathing room to engage in a sustained price war with Tesco or Asda. The profound tragedy of the 2005 buyout was that it stripped Toys R Us of the one resource it desperately needed to survive the coming decade: capital. The company was placed into a rigid financial straitjacket, forced to march forward while carrying an impossible, suffocating burden. They were bleeding cash at an alarming rate, simply to stand still. And standing still was the most dangerous thing a retailer could possibly do in the mid-2000s. Because while the executives were frantically juggling quarterly interest payments and the physical stores were slowly crumbling into obsolescence, a completely new existential threat was quietly gathering momentum. A digital storm was brewing, and the heavily indebted, slow-moving giant was entirely unprepared for the impact. By the mid-2000s, as the executives of Toys R Us grappled with the suffocating reality of their newly acquired multi-billion-dollar debt, a quiet but profound revolution was taking place inside millions of British homes. The shrill, mechanical screech of dial-up internet was rapidly being replaced by the silent, always-on connection of broadband. Personal computers were migrating from the isolated corners of home offices into the center of the living room, and a fundamentally new way of consuming goods was beginning to take root. E-commerce was no longer a niche, experimental concept. It was rapidly maturing into a dominant retail force, and the United Kingdom was adopting it faster and more aggressively than almost any other nation in Europe. At the vanguard of this digital invasion was Amazon. Initially dismissed by traditional retailers as a mere online bookstore, Jeff Bezos' company was rapidly expanding its inventory, meticulously building a logistics network designed for unprecedented speed and efficiency. Amazon understood a fundamental truth that the leadership at Toys R Us had entirely missed. The modern consumer valued convenience above all else. Driving to a retail park in the freezing British rain, wrestling for a parking space, and navigating cavernous, dimly lit aisles was no longer a magical family outing. It was an archaic, unnecessary friction. Tragically, Toys R Us did not merely ignore the digital threat. They actively outsourced their own digital soul to the very competitor that would eventually destroy them. In the year 2000, in a decision that would go down as one of the most catastrophic strategic blunders in retail history, the global corporate leadership signed a 10-year partnership with Amazon. Instead of investing the time and capital required to build their own bespoke e-commerce platform and fulfillment infrastructure, Toys R Us paid Amazon $50 million a year plus a percentage of sales to manage their online presence. When a British parent typed toysrus.co.uk into their browser during those crucial early years of the internet, they were seamlessly redirected to an Amazon-powered storefront. The executives believed they had executed a brilliant, cost-saving maneuver. They had secured an online presence without having to understand the complex, frightening mechanics of the internet. But in reality, they had invited the Trojan horse directly inside their fortress walls. For years, Toys R Us handed over its most valuable asset, its proprietary customer data, shopping habits, and search trends, directly to Amazon. They allowed their most dangerous rival to study exactly what toys British children wanted, when they wanted them, and at what price points. By the time the partnership inevitably soured and collapsed into bitter litigation, the damage was irreversible. Toys R Us had lost half a decade of critical digital learning. When they finally attempted to launch their own independent UK website, it was a disaster. The interface was clunky, the search functions were rudimentary, And, most crucially, their physical supply chain was entirely unsuited for the rapid, individualized demands of e-commerce. They were operating a massive, slow-moving logistics network designed to deliver pallets of toys to warehouse stores, whilst Amazon was perfecting the art of delivering a single action figure to a residential doorstep in 24 hours. The consequences on the British shop floor were humiliating. The vast, aging megastores were inadvertently transformed into free, uncompensated showrooms for Amazon. A new, devastating consumer behavior emerged, unofficially dubbed showrooming. Families would still visit the Toys R Us stores at the weekend, but not to make a purchase. Parents would let their children wander the aisles, physically touch the toys, and decide exactly what they wanted for their birthdays or Christmas. Then, while still standing under the flickering fluorescent lights of the Toys R Us aisle, the parent would pull out a smartphone, find the exact same item on Amazon for 20% less, and order it with free next-day delivery. For the exhausted, overstretched retail staff in places like Southampton, Bristol, and Leeds, it was an agonizing phenomenon to witness. They were doing the hard, physical labor of merchandising, stocking and displaying the products, only to watch the revenue flow silently out of their doors and into the servers of a digital competitor. The physical stores were absorbing all the exorbitant overhead costs, the rent, the business rates, the heating, the wages, while the e-commerce giants reaped all the profit. To combat this, Toys R Us needed to radically integrate their physical and digital offerings. They needed seamless, click-and-collect systems, a state-of-the-art website, and a unified inventory system. But the brutal reality of their financial cage snapped shut once again. The immense leveraged buyout debt detailed in the previous chapter dictated their every move. Every spare pound sterling generated in the UK was instantly diverted to service the transatlantic loan. There was simply no capital left to hire world-class software engineers, build automated fulfillment centers, or engage in a sustained online price war. The company was paralyzed, caught between a physical model that was too expensive to maintain and a digital world they were too poor to enter. They were watching their empire evaporate, click by click. But even if they had somehow possessed the capital to build a flawless digital storefront, they were about to face a secondary, existential crisis that no amount of e-commerce strategy could fix. The very definition of what a British child considered a toy was about to fundamentally and permanently change. While the executives in the boardroom were desperately fighting a losing battle against Amazon and the high street supermarkets, a far more insidious and uncontrollable shift was occurring within the very demographic they relied upon for survival. The fundamental definition of play was undergoing a radical, irreversible transformation. For decades, Toys R Us had structured its entire business model around a predictable, linear progression of childhood. A child would graduate from infant plush toys to building blocks, then to action figures or dolls, and finally to complex board games and bicycles, keeping them within the Toys R Us ecosystem until they were at least 10 or 12 years old. However, as the first decade of the 21st century drew to a close, a phenomenon known in the retail industry as age compression, or kids getting older younger, began to severely fracture this traditional timeline. Children were outgrowing physical toys at an unprecedented rate. The primary catalyst for this cultural earthquake arrived in 2010 with the launch of the iPad, swiftly followed by the universal proliferation of smartphones. Almost overnight, the coveted attention of older children was hijacked by glowing screens, interactive applications, and digital ecosystems. Suddenly, an 8-year-old who, a decade prior, would have been begging for the latest intricate Lego set or an entire wave of Power Rangers figures was now entirely fixated on playing Minecraft or watching YouTube. The age limit for traditional toy engagement plummeted. The lucrative window during which Toys R Us could capture a child's imagination and a parent's wallet shrank drastically from birth to 12 years down to birth to 7. This digital migration left vast swathes of the massive retail parks redundant. Entire aisles dedicated to older age brackets stood eerily quiet. Toys R Us attempted to pivot by stocking consumer electronics, video game consoles, and even tablets. But this proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. The profit margins on a plastic toy were historically robust. The margins on a piece of high-tech hardware like a tablet were razor-thin. Furthermore, attempting to sell electronics put the company in direct competition with specialist technology retailers and, once again, the ruthless pricing algorithms of Amazon. The magical place was fundamentally misaligned with the desires of the modern child. The immersive, tactile experience of wandering through a warehouse of plastic and cardboard held little appeal for a generation accustomed to the instant gratification of a touchscreen. Toys R Us was selling analog dreams in a rapidly accelerating digital reality. But the shrinking consumer base was only half of the tragedy. The physical spaces built to house those outdated dreams were about to become financial death traps. The original genius of the Toys R Us model had been the physical scale of the category killer. In the 1980s and 90s, operating a 50,000 square foot warehouse on an out-of-town retail park was a monumental advantage. But by the early 2000s, this sprawling footprint had mutated from an asset into a suffocating liability. The company was trapped inside its own architecture. The British commercial real estate market is notoriously unforgiving. Many of the sprawling warehouses occupied by Toys R Us were locked into long-term leases, heavily featuring upward-only rent reviews. This meant that regardless of how much footfall plummeted or how severely revenue declined, the rent only ever moved in one direction, upwards. Compounding this was the uniquely punishing British system of business rates, a property tax that disproportionately penalizes businesses with large physical footprints. As the government repeatedly hiked these rates, the fixed costs of simply keeping a single Toys R Us location open became astronomical. The business was caught in a lethal doom loop. Because footfall was dropping due to e-commerce and changing play habits, revenue was shrinking. Yet the fixed costs, rent, business rates, heating and lighting for a cavernous hangar, remained rigidly high. In a healthy, agile business, the immediate response would be to downsize, to exit the massive, unprofitable leases and relocate to smaller, more experiential, boutique-style stores in high-traffic areas. However, the staggering leveraged buyout debt imposed in 2005 meant they possessed zero financial agility. They could not afford the punitive penalty fees required to break their long-term commercial leases, nor did they have the capital to fit out a new fleet of smaller, modernized stores. They were geographically and financially imprisoned. To walk into a British Toys R Us during this era was to witness a stark physical manifestation of this decline, because the company could no longer afford the inventory levels required to fill the massive cubic volume of the stores. The visual merchandising became desperately sparse. Aisle widths were artificially expanded to fill dead space. Towering shelves that once held stock stacked to the ceiling were now only filled to eye level, exposing the raw, industrial scaffolding above. The vibrant energy of the 1990s had been replaced by a hollow, echoing melancholy. The business was hemorrhaging cash, sustaining an outdated physical footprint for a customer base that had largely moved online or grown out of toys entirely. The structural integrity of the UK operation was entirely compromised. It would only take one final severe financial shock to bring the entire crumbling edifice crashing down. And as 2017 approached, a devastating crisis regarding the pensions of the very employees who had built the empire was about to deliver that fatal blow. As 2017 entered its final quarter, the atmosphere within the UK operations of Toys R Us shifted from chronic anxiety to acute, suffocating panic. In September of that year, the American parent company officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the United States, crushed beneath the $5 billion debt mountain it had been forced to carry since the 2005 leveraged buyout. Initially, corporate communications attempted to reassure the British workforce, issuing statements that the UK subsidiary was a separate legal entity and would continue trading as normal through the crucial Christmas period. But on the shop floors of Britain's retail parks, the staff knew the reality. The supply chains were seizing up, inventory was becoming alarmingly thin, and an ominous silence emanated from the executive boardrooms. The true scale of the catastrophe, however, was not measured in empty shelves or declining footfall, but in a profoundly devastating revelation regarding the future of the employees themselves. In late 2017, a horrifying financial reality was laid bare. The Toys R Us UK pension scheme was harbouring a catastrophic deficit. The fund, relied upon by thousands of current and former staff members for their retirement, was in the red to the staggering tune of £37 million. For the dedicated workforce, many of whom had spent 2 or 3 decades manning the tills, restocking the sprawling aisles, and acting as the human engine of the so-called magical place, this news felt like a visceral betrayal. It highlighted the cruel, lopsided priorities of the corporate structure over the previous 12 years. While hundreds of millions of pounds had been ruthlessly siphoned out of the UK business to service the interest payments of transatlantic private equity firms, the very fund designed to protect the futures of the British workers had been starved of necessary contributions. The human toll of this revelation was profound. Employees who had dedicated their entire working lives to the retailer suddenly faced the terrifying prospect that their promised pensions might be slashed or vanish entirely. The morale within the aging, freezing warehouses, already battered by years of underinvestment and relentless job cuts, collapsed completely. Staff members were expected to put on a cheerful face, stack the remaining stock, and welcome festive shoppers, all whilst carrying the crushing weight of their own compromised financial security. The £37 million black hole transformed a struggling retail operation into a toxic corporate crisis. The company was no longer just fighting a losing battle against Amazon or the high street supermarkets. It was fighting for its legal right to exist. The massive pension deficit triggered the immediate involvement of the Pension Protection Fund, PPF, the UK's statutory safety net for insolvent retirement schemes. The PPF possessed the power to force the company into immediate administration if they believed the fund was being recklessly endangered. Suddenly, the slow, agonizing decline of the empire was drastically accelerated. The clock was ticking, and the executives were completely out of time. Desperate to avoid immediate collapse and buy enough time to trade through the lucrative Christmas season, the UK leadership scrambled to assemble a survival plan. In December 2017, they proposed a Company Voluntary Arrangement, or CVA. This is a drastic, legally binding insolvency procedure designed to allow a struggling company to renegotiate its debts and liabilities while continuing to trade. The proposed CVA was a brutal admission of defeat regarding the original business model. Toys R Us UK planned to permanently close 26 of its largest, most unprofitable out-of-town warehouses and drastically slash the rent on the remaining properties. It was a strategy of radical amputation designed to save the vital organs of the business. However, a CVA requires the approval of the company's creditors, and the most formidable creditor at the table was the Pension Protection Fund, acting on behalf of the £37 million deficit. The PPF looked at the long history of corporate wealth extraction by the private equity owners and took a hardline stance. They declared they would vote against the CVA, effectively forcing the immediate liquidation of the entire UK company right before Christmas, unless Toys R Us instantly injected £9 million of cold, hard cash directly into the pension fund to secure it. It was an impossible ultimatum. The heavily indebted retailer simply did not have £9 million in liquid capital. What followed was a frantic, nail-biting period of high-stakes negotiation that played out in the national press. For days, the fate of 3,200 British jobs hung entirely in the balance. Finally, in a dramatic 11th-hour agreement just days before Christmas, a compromise was reached. The company scraped together enough immediate funding and pledged future assets to satisfy the PPF, and the CVA was formally approved. Management breathed a heavy sigh of relief, believing they had narrowly escaped the abyss. They had secured the legal right to shutter the bleeding stores and lower their rent. But the victory was entirely hollow. The CVA was not a cure, it was merely a temporary bandage applied to a fatal wound. The underlying rot, the insurmountable debt, the completely shattered supply chain, and the terminal lack of consumer relevance remained fundamentally unaddressed. The brutal reality of their situation crystallized mere weeks later. As the calendar turned to early 2018, the hangover from a dismal, understocked Christmas trading period set in. The company's cash reserves were utterly depleted, and then the final, inescapable blow arrived. a routine, impending value-added tax, VAT bill, of £15 million owed to Revenue and Customs. Under normal circumstances, a retail giant could easily absorb a quarterly tax bill. But Toys R Us UK was running on fumes. They turned to their American parent company for an emergency cash injection, only to find the door firmly bolted. The US operation, mired in its own catastrophic bankruptcy proceedings, had completely cut off the financial oxygen to its European subsidiaries. There was no white knight coming. The banks refused to lend. The private equity owners had long since washed their hands of the mess. The company had reached the absolute edge of the precipice, and there was nothing left to break the fall. The golden quarter, usually the engine of the entire fiscal year, arrived in late 2017, shrouded in an atmosphere of intense corporate anxiety. For Toys R Us UK, the period leading up to Christmas had historically been a tightly choreographed spectacle of overwhelming abundance. But as December dawned, the sprawling retail warehouses painted a deeply distressing picture. The recently approved company voluntary arrangement had technically staved off immediate liquidation, but it had done absolutely nothing to restore the shattered confidence of global toy manufacturers. Suppliers, acutely aware of the perilous financial state of the British subsidiary and the ongoing bankruptcy proceedings of the American parent company, demanded upfront cash payments before shipping their goods. Toys R Us simply did not have the liquidity to meet these demands. Consequently, the colossal supply chain that once pumped millions of products into the UK stores abruptly choked. The visual impact on the shop floor was devastating. Aisles that should have been stacked to the ceiling with the season's most coveted items were noticeably sparse. To mask the alarming lack of inventory, staff were instructed to artificially space out the remaining products, front-facing single boxes across deep shelves to create a fragile, heartbreaking illusion of stock. For the 3,200 British employees manning the tills and walking the floors, it was an agonizingly surreal festive season. They were expected to wear their brightly colored uniforms and project the cheerful optimism synonymous with the brand, while simultaneously reading daily headlines detailing the imminent collapse of their livelihoods. The magical place they had worked so hard to maintain had been reduced to a hollow facade. The mood in the staff break rooms was a potent mixture of dark gallows humor and profound, quiet grief. They were trading through a Christmas miracle that no one actually believed would happen. The financial returns from that final, desperate December were predictably disastrous. The British public, sensing the decay and lured by the effortless convenience of Amazon and the aggressive pricing of the high street supermarkets, stayed away in droves. As the bleak, grey weeks of January 2018 stretched on, the temporary bandage of the CVA rapidly unspooled. The £15 million VAT bill owed to Revenue and Customs loomed with terrifying finality. With the American parent company having firmly shut the financial vault, and all avenues for a white knight rescue completely exhausted, the inevitable finally arrived. On the 28th of February 2018, the corporate life support was officially switched off. Toys R Us UK collapsed into administration. Moorfields Advisory was quickly appointed to manage the fallout, and their initial assessment was stark. Without a buyer for the entire business, a prospect that was virtually impossible given the astronomical debt and the archaic physical infrastructure, the only remaining course of action was a managed orderly liquidation. Within days, the atmosphere inside the stores transformed from quiet desperation to chaotic finality. The iconic, multicolored branding in the windows was abruptly pasted over with garish, bold yellow and black "Store closing" and "Everything must go" posters. The liquidation sale had begun. Initially, the discounts were modest, a mere 10 or 20% designed to clear the most valuable stock. But even these slight reductions drew an entirely different kind of crowd. The families seeking the joy of a weekend outing were rapidly replaced by bargain hunters, descending upon the retail parks to pick through the remains of the fallen empire. As March dragged into April, the discounts plunged steeper, and the reality of the end became physically tangible. The vast, warehouse scale of the category killer model, which had once been its greatest asset, now served only to magnify its demise. As the inventory was systematically stripped away, the sheer, terrifying emptiness of the 50,000 square foot hangars was laid bare. Entire rows of industrial shelving stood completely barren, exposing the scuffed linoleum floors and the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights. Customers who visited during these final weeks often described a profound sense of melancholy. Many were parents who had grown up in the 1990s, walking those exact same aisles as children with a sense of boundless wonder. They had brought their own children to the liquidation sale, not just to secure a discounted board game or a half-price action figure, but to say a final, tangible goodbye to a cornerstone of their own youth. They wandered through the echoing, denuded aisles, pushing the oversized metal trolleys past empty racks, witnessing the definitive end of an era. The magic had not just faded, it was being systematically boxed up, heavily discounted, and carried out of the automatic doors for the very last time. The burden of this extended, painful funeral fell squarely on the shoulders of the retail staff. They were tasked with the heartbreaking job of dismantling their own workplace. They broke down the promotional displays, packed unsold inventory onto wooden pallets, and watched as the very fixtures and fittings of the stores, the shelves, the display cases, the shopping trolleys themselves, were tagged with price stickers. They were managing the chaotic final transactions of a frustrated public, all while facing their own impending unemployment in a fiercely competitive retail job market. The dignity and resilience they displayed during those chaotic final weeks stood in stark, damning contrast to the reckless financial engineering of the executives and private equity firms that had orchestrated their downfall. By mid-April, there was almost nothing left to sell. The shelves were entirely stripped, the stock rooms were hollowed out, and the sprawling car parks outside stood empty. The final act of the tragedy was ready to commence. On Tuesday, the 24th of April, 2018, the protracted, painful demise of Toys R Us in the United Kingdom reached its absolute conclusion. The final 75 stores, scattered across retail parks from Aberdeen to Plymouth, locked their doors for the very last time. There was no grand ceremony, no final broadcast of the famous television jingle, only the harsh metallic rattle of security shutters being dragged down across glass frontages. The vibrant, multicolored signs featuring Geoffrey the giraffe were unceremoniously unbolted, leaving behind pale, sun-bleached silhouettes on the corrugated steel cladding. The immediate aftermath was a landscape of profound, physical emptiness. The category-killer business model that had been the cornerstone of their absolute dominance in the 1990s had suddenly transformed into an insurmountable urban blight. What does a community do with a 50,000 square foot, windowless warehouse located on the edge of a dual carriageway? These colossal structures were simply too massive and too expensive for the vast majority of modern retailers to absorb. For years following the collapse, many of these buildings sat entirely abandoned. They became ghost ships of British retail, their sprawling, weed-choked car parks serving as a stark, concrete monument to a bygone era of unchecked consumerism. But the true devastation was not architectural, it was profoundly human. Over 3,200 people were abruptly cast into the volatile British job market. This was a workforce that had endured years of compounding stress, managing underfunded stores, battling through the anxiety of the pension deficit crisis, and ultimately dismantling their own livelihoods during the chaotic liquidation sales. The human engine that had powered the magical place was abruptly switched off, leaving behind a profound sense of betrayal among staff who felt they had paid the ultimate price for decisions made in boardrooms an ocean away. As the dust settled on the empty aisles, the business and financial communities began to conduct a thorough autopsy of the fallen giant. The convenient, heavily publicized narrative was that Toys R Us was simply a casualty of the internet, a dinosaur that failed to evolve in the age of the asteroid. But the reality, as the timeline of its demise clearly demonstrates, was a far more complex and toxic cocktail of corporate arrogance and ruthless financial engineering. The empire did not fall solely because British families stopped buying toys, nor did it fall exclusively because Amazon offered next-day delivery. It fell because its foundation was fundamentally compromised by the $6.6 billion leverage buyout of 2005. The transatlantic private equity firms, Bain Capital, KKR, and Vornado, had effectively shackled a healthy, profitable retailer to a mountain of catastrophic debt. They extracted immense wealth from the operational cash flow to service their loans, starving the UK stores of the vital capital required to repair leaky roofs, modernize the shopping experience, or invest in a robust digital infrastructure. When the retail landscape inevitably shifted, when the supermarkets launched aggressive price wars, when Amazon redefined convenience, and when children traded plastic action figures for glowing tablet screens, Toys R Us possessed absolutely no financial agility to respond. They were a heavyweight boxer stepping into the ring with their hands tied firmly behind their back. The catastrophic decision to outsource their early e-commerce operations to Amazon only compounded this paralysis, blinding them to a decade of critical digital evolution. The collapse of Toys R Us UK stands as a definitive cautionary tale for the modern retail industry. It is a brutal demonstration that historic brand loyalty and massive physical scale offer zero protection against systemic financial extraction and technological disruption. It proved that a business cannot simply rely on the warm nostalgia of parents if the physical reality of the store is cold, expensive, and inconvenient. Today, the sprawling warehouses that once echoed with the frantic energy of Christmas shoppers have either been demolished, subdivided into smaller units, or repurposed as logistics hubs for the very e-commerce giants that helped orchestrate their downfall. The physical footprint of the empire has been almost entirely erased from the British landscape. Yet, for an entire generation of adults who grew up in the 1980s and 1990s, the memory of that spectacular, overwhelming abundance remains fiercely intact. The magical place no longer exists on the map, but it survives as a vivid, bittersweet fragment of British cultural history, a colossal dream of childhood that was meticulously constructed, relentlessly monetized, and ultimately, systematically dismantled. The story of Toys R Us in the United Kingdom is frequently misremembered simply as a tragic victim of the internet age, a slow-moving casualty of Amazon's relentless efficiency and the rise of the smartphone. But the true autopsy of this retail giant reveals a much darker and more complex reality. It is fundamentally a story of how a vibrant, globally beloved empire was financially strip-mined by private equity. The staggering leveraged buyout of 2005 transformed a place of genuine childhood wonder into a sterile vehicle for debt servicing. It placed a multi-billion-dollar anchor around the neck of the British operation, fatally crippling its ability to adapt, innovate, or survive when the digital storm finally arrived. For the over 3,000 British workers who abruptly lost their livelihoods, and for the millions of adults who once viewed those giant, fluorescent-lit warehouses as magical weekend destinations, the collapse was deeply personal. The massive, empty retail units that subsequently littered the country stood as silent, concrete monuments to a boardroom strategy that relentlessly prioritized short-term wealth extraction over long-term sustainability. The category-killer physical infrastructure that originally made them untouchable titans ultimately became the very cage that trapped them. Today, the mechanics of consumerism have permanently shifted. The frictionless convenience of the digital click has entirely replaced the tactile thrill of wandering the aisle. Yet the legacy of Toys R Us remains powerfully etched into the cultural memory of an entire generation. Its demise serves as a stark, unforgiving reminder that no brand, regardless of its historical dominance or emotional resonance, is too big to fail. Nostalgia alone cannot pay the commercial rent or service insurmountable corporate debt. The magical place may have closed its metal shutters forever, but the brutal lessons of its collapse continue to echo through the corridors of modern retail. If you found this deep dive into the fall of Toys R Us UK insightful, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a comment below. We would love to hear your memories of wandering those giant toy aisles and to know which industry titan you believe might be making these exact same fatal mistakes today. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next documentary.